This is Get Uncomfortable, the podcast about race, politics, religion, and all the things we avoid talking about at holiday parties and in mixed company with me, Adam Smith. Since General Tucumsa Sherman, on behalf of the U.S. government, promised all freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, and treaties brought about by the U.S. Dakota War in 1862, discussions about compensation of Indigenous and Black folks for our land, trauma, and free labor have taken place. Reparations are not a new concept in the United States and have been paid to Japanese internment camp and Holocaust survivors alike. Yet, we get stuck when bills like H.R. 40 are introduced at the federal level, which merely call for a commission to study reparations. What many Americans should be reminded about this is that resources are not only set to create real healing from our history of colonialism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness, but an equal economic playing field, a debt that is far overdue. Today, we are joined by Nevada Littlewolf and Brett Grant, who are key organizers and coalition builders who brought together Minnesota's Black and Indigenous communities to discuss reparations that were aimed to bridge and bring together each community. Nevada, Brett, welcome. Let's get uncomfortable. Nevada, Brett, welcome. Let's get uncomfortable. Thank you all for being here. So, we can just kick it off by just starting, we'll talk specifically about Minnesota, but can you both talk a little bit why you think reparations are important and imperative in communities, especially as it relates to the United States move towards equity, justice, and real healing?
Well, I'll start. I think in Minnesota, we have been looking at a lot of issues related to our disparities for quite a long time. And I can think about starting work with youth organizing and community organizing and youth justice and just issues around our community, particularly American Indian and other communities of color. And 20, 30 years ago, when I was really starting out, I had a lot of people just say, oh, this isn't about race. We're doing fine. You're just trying to make this about a race issue. And it's like, well, when I can see that we have American Indian kids and Black and brown kids going through systems at higher rates, that's just what I see. There's something is happening here. And then I think over time, we've had different organizations and institutions go into the research and create research reports around the disparities. And one, for instance, in Northeast Minnesota, which was about the juvenile justice system and the disproportionate amount of Black and Indigenous youth that were incarcerated in juvenile detention centers. And so, yes, lo and behold, these numbers are astronomical in the state of Minnesota, and the disparities are very high when we look at health issues, economic issues, education issues, kind of across the board. And so this is I would say that I think we've known this for a long time. And I think it's something that we have an obligation to do the work and get better and be better here in Minnesota. I think that's what led us, or at least brought me into the conversation around reparations, really was my business partner, Brett Grant. And I think he could really talk, more about kind of what was happening legislatively related to reparations in Minnesota and the work that we continue to do together.
Nevada, thank you. Yeah, Brett, and we definitely want to talk about Minnesota, right? Because Minnesota's the model, my home state, all the things. It isn't like reparations conversations are new. Tecumseh Sherman, 40 acres and a mule. People started after so-called Reconstruction and Emancipation and Juneteenth. They started with less than nothing, right? So there was some ideas about, okay, we have all these former enslaved people, right? What are we going to do? How are we going to, because not only did people not own anything, which land ownership and education are the two wealth building things that we can do in our nation. And we've given not only Black folks, but Native Indigenous folks, we have left it by systems and by laws, kept people out of those two things, land ownership and education. So when Reconstruction happens and slavery is so-called abolished, and well, we've got to give folks something to get started. And then people didn't keep their word. In particular, because the South, right? The North needed the South, and the South was coming back, and the South is ticked off, right? You're not giving 40 acres of our land to these former slaves, right? And the North needed them to come back. And so it was like, no, we're not going to keep our word to do any of this. So Brett, talk a little bit about, because this isn't new, talk about why reparations are important and how reparations not only can lead to true equity, but really to justice in our country.
Yeah, thank you for that. For me, it's simple. It's because reparations really goes beyond talk, and it brings into focus action. And so many people are willing to talk about equity and talk about this and talk about justice. But when you bring the conversation to reparations, now the talk has to meet the action. And whenever I think about it, I think about a conversation with a good friend of mine, elderly white woman. We had a lot of discussions about equity, justice, and she would always want to talk to me about ways that her organization could become more equitable. But I remember one conversation I was saying, well, what about reparations? And then this time we were talking about in the context of finances and money and tangible things. I said, and I forgot the example I said, but it was something asking her, would you, if you own some land, would you be willing to give your land up in the name of justice? And that's when she was like, well, I'd have to think about that. Whereas before, theoretically, so we should do all these things and equity is important. But if it requires you to give up something, then it becomes a different matter. So that's what I think about, and it's more nuanced because even in the discussion of reparations, it can go beyond just, financial strategies or money or those kinds of things. But I think it's important because it matches talk with action.
That's really good. Yeah. And I think like you're talking about, there's so many people for equity, but they aren't willing to acknowledge inequity, right? There can't be a positive. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but there can't be a positive without a negative, right? So I can't be for equity and not acknowledge that there are inequities that have benefited me. And there's so many folks when you have the reparations conversation that say, well, I don't have slavery was so long ago. Well, how about then we get rid of all the stuff you have because slavery happened and Jim Crow and redlining and treaties that weren't kept and all of the things. And then we can start equal. But it's easy to talk about equity when the gun went off, half a lap ago and you've been running around the track. And then you say, well, okay, go ahead. Well, we have to do things, but the first step is personally acknowledging I may have so-called pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, but I did so on the moving walkway at the airport. That helped me. Yes, I was walking, but the moving walkway was helping my momentum, right? So Nevada, can you talk a little bit about from a standpoint, because I want to kind of put a bow on the reparations conversation about this part. What are some of the benefits? So what do you tell our white brothers and sisters, right, in Minnesota about the benefits of reparations for them and their communities? Because I think that's where the answer has to come, right? Yes, it's about Native, Indigenous communities, Black communities. We gave reparations to Japanese from the internment camps. There's a lot of Holocaust survivors whose families are still getting reparations, right? What are the benefits to somebody who isn't a member of the communities that would receive reparations? What are some of the benefits for them in those conversations that you've had?
I'm a big fan of Paul Wellstone, like many people in Minnesota. And we've all heard it, right? Like we've all heard his famous quote about we all do better when we all do better. And I just think that, I actually was at a meeting today and I stopped into this little gift shop and I was talking to the clerk and she told me that when she got to work this morning, she saw footprints in the snow, and that they weren't boot tracks or sneakers or anything like that. They were bare feet, like bare feet foot tracks in the snow. And so we were talking about the unhoused in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, and across the state. And I think about reparations, at least in the conversations I've had with folks about reparations, we didn't even really get to the point of like, what is reparations, what isn't reparations in terms of what that can look like. But we understood that there are things that should not be happening, right? Like we should not have unhoused American Indian people, for instance, in the Twin Cities or anywhere in the state when we have 11 sovereign nations here and we have treaties that are in place for our sovereign nations. And even if the tribal members in the state of Minnesota do not belong to one of the 11 sovereign nations, there still should be resources and opportunities for our Indigenous brothers and sisters and family. And so when I think about reparations, it's like, I know that when our community is doing better, we bring so many resources back into the overall larger community. And that is like ultimately the ultimate thing that I think about related to reparations is just making sure that people have the things that they need, like the basic things, which is like, a part of our treaty rights, but also it's just kind of basic human rights. And so I know that when we were working on reparations, the legislation in Minnesota, we didn't propose a bill that said reparations will be this, and this. The bill was actually to say, we want to bring together the African American, Black community, Minnesotans, and American Indian Minnesotans together to discuss what reparations could look like in this state, to have the conversations and to have, they're hard conversations. And we found that Brett and I, when we were organizing, for this legislation, we found that these conversations are very, very difficult conversations. They're hard conversations to have and to hold and to share. It's also in the movement forward and thinking about solidarity. There's also hard conversations in that.
That's so good. Shout out to the late great Paul Wellstone. We all do better when we all do better. So simple, but so real. One of the pieces that you said that's so interesting that I think sometimes people miss. Nevada was talking about sovereign nations and treaties that haven't been followed. There are treaties and agreements between the Black community and the United States that haven't been followed over and over and over again. So if you think of it as a handout, okay. If you think of it as an investment and an economic investment, the reason why corporations like Target don't pay a huge amount of taxes and Amazon and others is because of an investment of people in Nashville. They wanted Amazon to come to Nashville, so they gave them tax breaks, right? Because that's an investment in the community because it lifts people up. It always seems like it's an issue when you give it to Black or Native or poor or queer folks. When you give it to Amazon and Target, it's not a problem, right? When you give, then it isn't socialism anymore, right? So those are the challenges. And so I think thinking through the process in Minnesota, Brett, Nevada touched on it. So talk a little bit about, because I know that Representative Clark and Susan Allen were involved in proposing the legislation. There are other municipalities. We got HR 40 out there. There's other states, right, that are looking at reparations commissions to study what does reparations, we can't even get that done. What would reparations look like? Talk a little bit about the process in Minnesota where the legislation got proposed and the uniqueness, because I think the piece of the Minnesota model that I would call it is the combination of two communities that have experienced very different trauma, but share some of the same journey and some of the same struggle and harm.
Yeah, that's exactly why I was excited to work on that legislation. And I think the interesting thing to me is that when Representative Karen Clark approached me about the reparations work, she had already been working with a lot of community organizations in Minnesota. And, I actually wanted to propose it a lot earlier, but based on those conversations, determined that that wasn't the right time. And even when we decided to introduce it, there was still some, hesitancy on her part, wondering, is this the right time? But more of the conversation she had kind of led her to think like, yes, this is the right time. And I think one of the powerful things was this public hearing we had on reparations. So before the start of this session in particular, this was the session, I think this was 2018. I always get that a little confused, but she was about to retire. And before she retired, she wanted to hold a public hearing, bringing together African-American Minnesotans, American Indian Minnesotans. That was a language in the bill, representing our communities. And just hear from people when you think about reparations, what comes to mind? And so there were powerful testimonies. I mean, I always talk about that day was so powerful because the roles were reversed, where typically you had the legislators sitting at their powerful positions at those tables. The community was at those tables this time. And most of the legislators were in the audience. So the communities were the ones who were holding those positions of power visually, in addition to just the powerful testimonies. So, yeah, and you said it. I think when you talk about the way that this bill works, one, it was modeled after H.R. 40, the federal legislation. But the unique piece to this one was that it incorporated and wanted to bring both groups together. And so instead of just focusing on the African-American community, it wanted to bring the African-American community with the American Indian community together to study proposals and then to bring those proposals to the legislature. And so, as Nevada was saying, a lot of those discussions ended up kind of losing sight of that the intent of the bill was for an African-American group to study and to come up with proposals for the African-American community, an American Indian group to study and come up with proposals for their communities. And then we could work in solidarity to support each other. But a lot of it kind of throughout the process got stuck on, well, you already have reparations. So why do we need reparations? Why does your group need reparations when the African American group has never received reparations? And it got lost in a lot of that. That wasn't the only thing, but that was a powerful piece at play in our communities coming together. But for me, the learning possibilities is what makes that union so powerful. Like you mentioned, the 40 acres and a mule piece, and I remember after one community meeting, one of the sisters in the American Indian community came to me and said, you know what? One of the tensions we hold about the 40 acres and a mule piece is this question of on whose land. And so I had never heard that before, and I was like, thank you, because do you know the educational value of just us coming together to have that discussion and to be able to just dialogue about that? So that to me is the powerful piece of bringing us both together.
That was gold, right? How do you give away 40 acres of land that belongs to the sovereign nations and to the people? It wasn't your land to give away in the first place. And so I think one of the really interesting things that you're touching on, right, is how colonialism and white supremacy works. In our communities, we don't understand sometimes that there's enough trauma for all. Well, your experience was worse than mine, and your experience was worse. Nevada, talk a little bit about, because 13 nations in Minnesota, am I correct?
11 sovereign nations.
11, I apologize, 11 sovereign nations in the state of Minnesota. So you don't just have the Black community and the American Indian community of Minnesota. You have the Black community and 11 nations who all have different ideas, different concepts of, hey, why don't we just get them to follow the treaties that are currently in place that they haven't kept? Why don't we do this? Nevada, talk a little bit about how those conversations played out in tribal communities and how, and you and I talked about this, how some folks said, well, you need to get all of the community's agreement before we even have people hearings and talk about legislation.
Just like a kind of a point of reference, I think first is just understanding that there's a difference between a treaty between the American government and sovereign nations, and then saying there's treaties that were between people or agreements between the government and groups of people or organizations or corporations. I think our nations are considered, and it is a technical term. It's not necessarily a good thing, but we're considered dependent domestic nations within the United States boundary, right? And so we are not, we are tribal nations and we have sovereignty, and it's a unique political status that no other people or groups within the United States have. I think that's a really important thing to like understand, that our treaties are the supreme law of the land, right? And when the treaties were made, it really was an agreement that as tribal people and tribal members, we would be giving up certain things in order for, and we would be receiving other things, right? And so that is actually how the state of Minnesota can be the state of Minnesota, is because of these treaties that occurred 1854, 1855, right around in that time is like when many of the treaties in Minnesota were being signed. And so I want to say that because I think it's really important for people to understand that these are legal documents, and that they have legal standing like no other documents do, and they are the supreme law of the land. And so I think that is where the conversations, when we are having conversations, we also know that while there are 11 sovereign nations in Minnesota, which most of them are, they're Anishinaabe or they're Dakota. So even within that, there's different cultural considerations between the tribal entities and groups. And not to mention that each, then there's the different bands of the tribes. I think in Minnesota, we also have the unique history with the hangings that happened in Mankato, and the laws that we still have on at the legislature about Dakota people not even being allowed in the state of Minnesota. And so there was a lot of discussion at the people's hearing about the fact that many Indigenous people to Minnesota were actually, we know the history and the story about what happened in Mankato and that execution, which was the largest mass execution ordered by President Abraham Lincoln in our country, right? And that happened here in Minnesota, and it was Dakota people that were executed. But then there were so many people that were actually removed from this area and then pushed out into the Dakotas. And so how do we reconcile that when they don't have that legal standing as a tribal nation within Minnesota boundaries, or if their families or their ancestors were moved out, but they're now living in a totally different area? How can they also seek reparations in Minnesota? So there were a lot of very, I think, robust conversations about what and we had to get into like the history of the state to really understand there's a lot more to this conversation than just this idea that I think a lot of people want to say, oh, you want reparations because you want a paycheck or something, right? Like you just want money. And it's like, that is not like, it's like, we really want to get at like where these issues stem from, and why we're in a position right now to even start talking about reparations. And like, that isn't even getting to like, what does reparations mean for our communities?
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Get Uncomfortable. Get Uncomfortable is produced by me, Rachel Hansen, and Adam A. Smith. Now, we wanted to let you know that this episode is part 1 of a 2-part conversation talking about reparations in Minnesota.